Okay, welcome everybody. So we are really happy today to welcome Julien Combe. Julien is an assistant professor at the Ecole Polytechnique in Paris. He's working mainly on matching and is going to present today a paper entitled Unpaired kidney exchange, overcoming the double coincidence of wounds without medium of exchange. This is a joint work with Mohammad Akbarpour, Yinghua, Victor Hilaire, Robert Shimer, and Olivier Tercieux. We also have the pleasure to welcome Philipp Strack from Yale as a discussant. So thanks a lot, Philipp, and thanks a lot, Julien, for being with us today. The seminar is working as usual. So Julien is going to make some breaks at some relevant moment. And during these breaks, you could unmute yourself and ask directly your questions to Julien. Be aware that the talk is recorded. So if you don't want to be in the video, you can just ask your question through the chat window and we'll ask the question to Julien during the breaks. Or actually, in the chat, the co-author Julien who are participate to the talk will reply directly to your question. So feel free to ask your question also through the chat. In case you have a non-stable internet connection, I will put in a few minutes in the chat a link for the slides that you could download. So Julien, Philippe, thanks again for being with us. Julien, the screen is yours, so it's your talk now.
Thank you, Olivier. Thank you, everyone. It's such a great pleasure to be here today. That's actually probably the biggest crowd I've had so far in my career, maybe. So I'm very glad to be at this virtual market design seminar. So the great thing of having a lot of co-authors is that the probability that at least one is in the chat is high. So I think they are here, so don't hesitate to ask questions, they can answer. And I will unmute myself. I will stop sometimes to take questions also. So today I'm going to present this joint work on unpaired kidney exchange. Let me start with a little bit of background. So we are all market designers here, so I think the motivation is clear. If you are a patient and you need a kidney, you have two options in front of you. First, you can wait for a deceased donor, but the problem is that the supply has been quite steady over the past 10 years, and so the demand has grown. And so this is the blue curve that you see here is actually the waiting list in France. So we were at like 4,000 patients waiting in 1993, and in 2017, we were at more than 13,000 patients waiting. The second option is to wait for to have a transplantation from a living donor. So we have two kidneys, we can give one while staying alive. So we know that in average, the quality of living donors are better than the one of deceased donors. But the problem is that many patients are incompatible with the donors who is willing to give to them. So this has led to the development of kidney exchange programs that we know well. And one of the first exchange technology that was available in kidney exchange program was what I will call here pairwise exchanges. So very simple, two pairs who have compatible donors who are exchanging their donor. And so this exchange were done simultaneously. The donor was giving while the patient was receiving a kidney. And it's widely used in almost a lot of countries in the world who have kidney exchange program. And in general, you can think about cycles of exchange, but usually there is a limit on the size of such cycles. So this problem is kind of well known in economics, and it dates back from J. Vance. It's the problem of double coincidence of wounds. So to make this exchange, I need to have a donor compatible with your patient, and your donor needs to be compatible with me. Okay? And so this was already noted in the seminal application of kidney exchange. And so there have been some work in the literature to try to tackle this problem of double coincidence of wounds that limits the opportunity of exchanges. So some authors have studied the way to legalize kidney sales. Okay, and we know that so Mohammad has a paper on the market in Iran, which is one of the only country in the world that is doing a market for kidneys. A second option was to study how to thicken the market and increase the number of patients and donors in the pool, either by increasing participation or even by waiting. So just waiting to realize the match, to wait for the pool to thicken a little bit. Another way is to study new technologies for exchanges. So one of the main one has been chains initiated by altruistic donors. And recently, other type of technologies, such that sequential kidney exchange and vouchers that are used in the US have been studied in the literature. So what I'm going to show you today is a technology, a new technology to make this kidney exchange, what we call unpaired kidney exchange. And the idea is very simple. At every given point in time, you have a waiting list of pairs of unpaired donors without their patient and unpaired patients without their donor. Every time a pairs come in, you check whether the donor is compatible with the patient in the system. If there is any, you fix yourself whatever priority rule or tie-breaking rule you want, and you make this transplantation immediately. Then you will have one patient waiting alone in the system. This patient will join this waiting list of unpaired patients. Then if a new pairs come in, let's say you have this donor compatible with the patient of the incoming pairs, you make this transplantation immediately. Now you have a lone donor, an unpaired donor, he will join the waiting list of unpaired donors. If you have a new pair coming in, let's say that this donor can give to the new patient, you realize the transplantation, now you have one alone unpaired patient, one alone unpaired donor, they will join the respective waiting list, and you will continue to update the process like this. So the key thing is that you relax two constraints compared to pairwise exchange. First, like for chains, you allow the fact that donor give after their patient receives a kidney. And the second thing that you allow in this system is for donors to give before their patient receives. And this creates two practical risks that are important to keep in mind. The first one that is already well known, even for technologies such as chains, is the risk for donors to renege, so to say no in the future. And the second risk that we introduce in this system is that these unpaired patients who are alone can wait a very long time, and so it will create a waiting risk for these patients. Either they might die if they wait too long, or they might even not accept the system to unpair their donor in the case they have to wait too long. Okay? So these two risks, I want you to keep them in mind. They will be important to evaluate this mechanism. And what I'm going to do today is to show you how this technology works. First, using a simple dynamic matching model that will completely abstract from the two risks I just mentioned. And we'll just look at the mechanics to see, to quantify by how much you will decrease the waiting time of the patients in these systems. And second, using empirical data, so simulations using data from the French kidney exchange program, I will show you that first, what are the order of magnitudes of these two risks in terms of waiting time. And I hope to convince you that these two risks can be mitigated by first, if the market is large enough, and second, if you can use a practical design by integrating the system with the deceased donor list. And you will see how it performs in this simulation. So maybe it's a good time before I move to the model to stop here and to take questions if there are any. Okay, great. So let me move to the model then. So the model is very simple. It's actually imported from Itai and co-authors Operation research paper from 2019. So time is continuous, and pairs of incompatible patients and donor, they come in the system at the Poisson rate n. When a pairs come in with probability lambda, the patient is a hard to match patient. With probability 1 minus lambda, this patient is an easy to match patient. So hard to match patients are compatible with a donor with probability pH, and easy to match patients are compatible with a donor with a probability PE. And what we will do in the analysis is we will let pH tends to 0 and let PE being fixed constant at a given value. And in this simple model, I will assume that there is no exogenous exits. Okay, so that's going to be a pure mechanical model. Pairs will come in and will be matched by the mechanism that you will fix. And so in terms of the justification of why do we have these two types model, this is something that aims to capture some feature of the practical kidney exchange that we observe in practice. So these are the data for France. And you observe this type of bimodal distributions where you have a big group of pairs of patients that are almost never compatible with any given donor, and some other pairs that are almost always compatible with a given donor. Okay? So this type of model have been proposed in the literature and aim to capture these very sensitized patients and very easy patients to match. So before I move to the objective, maybe if there are questions about the model, I can just pause a little bit here. Okay, great. So what are we going to do? So you have this, primitives dynamic process, and once you fix an algorithm, you will decide how people will leave this process, because they will leave only when they will be matched. So once you fix the mechanism, let's say pairwise, chain, or unpaired, you have basically a Markov chain, and we will study the average waiting time of a patient at the steady state of this Markov chain. And we will do so for a vanishingly small pH and a constant PE. So remember, pH is the probability for hard to match patients to be compatible with a donor, and PE is the probability for easy to match patients. And so, as you can expect, easy to match patients are not going to be the problem here, because since their probability to be compatible is constant and the probability for hard to match tend to 0, you will accumulate a lot of hard to match in this process, and basically it's going to be easy to match pairs in this system. So the weighted waiting time of these easy to match patients are not going to be the problem here. So the key object that we need to study is this object here, which is composed of, so the waiting time of hard to match patient times their probability to be matched. So the first is tending to 0, the second at the limit is infinity because they are not compatible with anyone. And so we will study whether these two terms converge, the product of these two terms converge to a given constant. And so this is what we are going to do. And in terms of algorithm, we will plug the three algorithms I just mentioned at the beginning. First, pairwise exchange. So when you have a pairs coming in, you check whether you have cross compatibility to make an exchange. Then chain, I will just explain you in the next slide how it works in the model. And then unpaired that I just described to you at the beginning with these little dots. As soon as you have a pair coming in, you check whether the donor can give, whether the patient can give, and you make the transplantation immediately, and you keep track of the list of patients and donors in the system. And so I will explain chains, and then I will pause for some questions. So chains is very easy. At some given time in the pool, you have pairs of incompatible patients and donors. Maybe you have some compatibility in the pool, but you don't have double coincidence of ones, so they cannot exchange together. But once you have an altruistic donor, a donor without any patients, it's easy to make this exchange, right? The first patient receive a kidney, we ask the donor of the first patient to give to the second one, so on and so forth. And as soon as the patient coming in is compatible with the donor, we implement a chain like this. It's going to be a greedy chain in the sense that we will look randomly for the next patient compatible for a given donor, and we will stop when the last donor cannot give to anyone anymore. And this last donor will become the new directed donor in the future. So we will wait for new arrival. As soon as the patient is compatible with this donor, we continue the chain, the segment of the chain in the pool. So I'm going to pause here if there are any questions, and then I will show you the results. Great. So basically, in a nutshell, these are graphically the results. So on the y-axis, you have this lambda, which is the share of hard to match patients in the system. This is a primitive. And on the y-axis, you have this limit that I was talking about, which is the waiting time of hard to match patients times pH when pH tends to 0. As I told you, this object can converge to a constant, and these are basically the results for the mechanisms we consider. So the red line is basically unpaired, the green line is for chain, and the yellow line is for pairwise. And what basically you can see is that chain is doing better than pairwise, and this we already know, it's actually coming from Ashlagi et al. So pairwise scales in the order of 1 over pH squared when you have more hard to match than easy to match in the system. So this is why this constant explodes here. Okay. And basically, chain scales at the order 1 over pH, and this constant has been shown by the paper of Ashlagi et al. What we do in the paper is to characterize the constants for unpaired, which is here. And basically, unpaired improves upon pairwise and chains. And importantly, we can quantify using the primitives by how much. And so compared to pairwise, it does infinitely better in the sense that their ratio scales at the order 1 over pH. And compared to chains, they both scale at the order 1 over pH, but we have this ratio here, which is shown in the graph here. So I will just comment two important things to note in this graph. The first one is that you see that chain and pairwise have this upward slope in the graph, which means that the more easy to match patients you have in the system, so when lambda is small, you have more easy to match patients in the system, the better it is for hard to match patients. So their waiting time decrease when you increase the number of easy to match. And why is it so? It's because for pairwise easy to match pairs, they help to do cross-compatible exchange with hard to match patients. So the more easy to match, the better it is for the waiting time of hard to match patients. And for chains, the easy to match patient, they help to start new segment of the chain. So remember that once the chain ends, you have this new donor with a loan. And to start a new segment of the chain, you need a new pairs coming in that is compatible with this donor. And so the more easy to match patients arriving in the system, the higher the probability you have to start this new segment of the chain. So obviously, these are very rough intuitions because you need to balance sometimes of size and speed in this model. And these are why these constraints are hard to characterize in practice in the model. But what I want to note here is that this Unpaired has a downward slope here. And so it means that the more easy to match in the system, the worse it is for hard to match compared to the two other technologies. And why is it so? It's because since we completely unpair the patient and the donors in this technology, adding easy to match in the system is just taking away donors from hard to match patients. And so hard to match patients in Unpaired, they don't need to have more easy to match in the system to be matched. And this last second point I want you to note is that at the limits, when you have only hard to match in the system, you see that the waiting time of chain basically explodes for hard to match patients. And this is coming from this segment of the chain I was talking about. When you have only hard to match in the system, the probability to start a new segment of the chain vanishes because the probability for them to be compatible tends to 0. And this is not the case under Unpaired. This waiting time does not explode because as soon as a new pair comes in, you can use the donor to start new donations. And basically, this controls the fact that the more hard to match you have in the system, it's not worse for hard to match in Unpaired. So I'm going to, before talking about the optimal, maybe it's a good time to stop and ask whether there are any questions on these results.
Could you maybe give a little bit more intuition? It's really surprising to me, at least, that the easy to match agents don't help the hard to match agents here. Could you maybe, I was a bit slow in understanding this. Could you explain this again?
Yeah, sure. So here at the end, so because you completely, you don't, so in chains and in chains, you need, patients are used to start new segment of the chain. And so the fact to have more easy to match increase, so does not make this probability decrease compared to, because the hard to match will be very hard to start a new segment of the chain. For pairwise, you need them because they help to have cross compatibility. Wait, sorry about that. So I don't know where I stopped. So I was answering Philipp's question. I don't know if I did or.
Well, on my side, I didn't get the reply at all. So maybe I'm not the only one.
Okay, so I can answer again. So it's really the fact that in Unpaired, when you have hard to match coming in the system, you can use their donor before their patient receives, which is not the case under pairwise and chains. And this is why when you have only hard to match in the system, when they come in, you can use their donor to create more exchanges and the patient will receive later on. And so this effect controls the fact that the waiting time does not explode in the system. So I would guess that the intuition is this one. So I don't know if it, okay, great. I don't know if there are other questions. Okay. So I just talked about 3 mechanisms here. You can say maybe there are plenty of other mechanisms that can do better than Unpaired. So how much can we do better than Unpaired? So what about other mechanisms? So this is the definition that we have of what we call the optimal mechanism. So I'm putting it into bracket because as you can see, it's an inf. So what you do is you take any algorithm that has a stationary distribution in this framework. So it can be anything. So really imagine that, for instance, you stop easy to match to be matched to use their donor to fasten the match of hard to match. This is something that is acceptable. You can batch, wait a little bit and run every 5 periods any algorithm you want. As soon as there is a stationary distribution, it's going to be in this set of algorithms. Then you take the waiting time at the stationary distribution and you take the inf over all of the possible algorithms. And this is what we call the optimal waiting time. So this is not exactly a mechanism because I cannot tell you whether the inf is achieved by a given algorithm, but basically this is a lower bound of waiting time that you can achieve in this simple model. And what we can show is that basically we can prove that unpaired is not going to do worse than 2 times the waiting time of this optimal lower bound. Okay. So in a sense, the ratio is a constant. They both scales at the same order of 1 over pH, and I can bound the constants at which or worse can unpaired do. Okay. And this is a bit what is pictured here. And so this is our result on how to compare unpaired to any other algorithm you can think about. So to wrap up, and then I will pause again for questions. So we've shown that unpaired is basically in the same order of magnitude of an optimal. It cannot do worse than 2 times any mechanism in this simple framework. It outperforms chains in n chains, as we already know, outperform pairwise. And it's very surprising to see because unpaired is a very greedy mechanism. You just match transplantation, you just do transplantation as soon as they are available. I haven't talked at all about the tie-breaking rule you can use. You can pick randomly a donor and do this match, and that's going to have this order of magnitudes that I just shown. And so this is what we have in the theoretical parts. So maybe if there are any questions on this last bit on the optimal mechanism. Okay, great. So let me move to the empirical part now. Okay, so I have plenty of time. I will finish probably earlier, but that's better. So I can slow down a little bit for the empirical part. So let me give you a bit of context about the data that we have. So France kidney exchange program started in 2013, and it only allows pairwise exchanges. Okay? So it might change in the future, and maybe if I have time, I can talk about it at the end of the talk. But we have all the data from 2013 to 2018, and it's centralized at the national level. We like centralized things in France. So it's nice because for us, it allows us to have all the data of the universe of kidney exchanges in France. Because it's not like in the US where you have different pools that compete between each other. Here, everything is centralized at the national level. And so we have all the data on the pairs who participate in the kidney exchange program. So as you can see, it's a very small program. Only 78 pairs participated over this whole period. They run the algorithm of pairwise exchange every 3 months. And in average, the pool size at each of these match run is 18, and the graft percentage is 15%. And what we have in the data also is during this period, we have 508 pairs who performed an incompatible transplantation. So which is called desensitization, which is a medical procedure that allows you to become compatible with your donor, even if you are not, at the cost of some quality of the graft, of course. But this is an alternative option that pairs can do rather than joining the kidney exchange program. So, they use a poor exchange technology. They are very constrained by this double coincidence of wands. So the match rate is very small. And so a few pairs participate in this program. And so these 508 pairs will be important for us because we can use them to scale and try to see what would happen if participation increased in this market. And we have also all the data on the deceased donors and the deceased donor list in France in this period. So we have all the dates at which the donors were used. We have all the compatibility of all the patients with all the pairs. So this is true compatibility. Okay, we have their characteristics, so we can check exact compatibility. So what is called a virtual cross match. And we have all the characteristics of the patients and of the donors. And so the simulations I'm going to show you first, the easy baseline of the very small market of France. I will resimulate what happened in this period. And the only random thing in these simulations are going to be arrival times of the pairs. So the only thing we observe in our data is they run the algorithm every 3 months. And so we observe at which match run each pair participated, but we don't know the exact date at which the pair came in the system. So we will draw randomly their arrival time consistent with their participation. So if you came at the KF match run, then we will draw a random arrival between the KS and KS minus 1, K minus 1's batch run. Okay. And to stick to the theoretical framework, I will assume that there is no exogenous exit in this simulation. And in the paper, we do robustness check where we include exogenous exits, and basically qualitatively nothing changed. Okay. And so that's going to be the first table I'm going to show you, this very small market first, and then I will show you other tables where we will increase the size and when we will use deceased donors in the system. So the very first benchmark, and then I will stop for questions, is so if you use Pairwise, you get 29% of the patients grafted. So this is the case because we do online pairwise. We don't do it every 3 months like in France. We do it as soon as there is a new pair coming in the system. The average waiting time of patients is 700 days. If you add a chain in the system, basically you increase a little bit, but not by much. And if you use Pairwise, you graft 57% of the patients, and the waiting time of the patients decreases to 400 days. And what is nice with the data, what you can do is you know everything that happened between 2013 and 2018, so you can calculate the best ex-post match that you can achieve to minimize the overall waiting time of the pairs. Okay? So this is a kind of lower bound that you can achieve in our data. And this, what we call this omniscient best ex-post match that you can achieve, basically graft 58% of the pairs, and the waiting time is 425 days. So this is consistent with our theory that, unpaired is not too far from optimal. That's a bit what this is saying. But of course, now I've shut down so far the 2 risks I mentioned at the beginning, and they are very important, and this is what you see here. So the waiting time, the median waiting time of unpaired patients who are alone in the system is roughly 200 days in these simple simulations, and the waiting time of unpaired donors is 300 days. So this might be problematic. And so let me stop here, and then I will tell you how we can improve and these 2 risks and manage these 2 risks in practice. Okay, great. So how can we reduce these 2 risks? So first, let me start with the easy one. Your data is very small. You have only 78 pairs. Maybe it's just coming from the fact that your data is very small. So I'm going to show you larger market simulations by adding these desensitized pairs that we also have in the data, and also by simulating pools that are coming from, pools from the US pools. Sorry. So we use that data generated by simulations, and the French simulations are going from true data of compatibility. Second, what you can do also is to integrate the unpaired mechanism with the deceased donor lists. So what you can do to decrease the risk of waiting time for unpaired donors is to start to offer good quality deceased donors to unpaired patients that are waiting in P. And by good quality, that's what we do in the paper. We have a measure of quality of deceased donors that is used in the literature, and we filter the donors to give a quality that is similar to living donors. The second thing that you can do to decrease the renal risk of donors is to ask donors who are alone in the system to give quickly to a patient who is waiting on this waiting list of patients of deceased donors. This big waiting list of 14,000 people that we have in France that is outside of the kidney exchange program. We can ask an unpaired donor indeed to give to this patient. So you have several ways to define this donation. What I'm going to show you is a first version where you will ask the donor to give to a waiting patient only when you use deceased donors to give to a patient in P. So as soon as you use a deceased donor to reduce the waiting time of a patient in P, you need to give back immediately a donor from your waiting list D. So if the waiting list D is empty, you cannot use a deceased donor to decrease the waiting time of patients. A second option could be to ask donors to give immediately as soon as their patient receives a living donation. So as soon as their patients are going to, when they come as a pair and the donor gives to their patient, they give immediately to someone on the deceased donor list. And then you keep a joker to use a deceased donor later on. So that could be a second option designed to integrate the deceased donor list. So what I'm going to show you is basically the first option, where they can still wait alone in the system, and they will give in case you use a deceased donor to give to a patient in P. And so I hope you will see that it strongly weakens the 2 risks that I just mentioned. So I give you the results, and then I pause for this new integration of deceased donors. So this is basically the small market of 78 pairs, where you offer good quality deceased donors to patients who are alone in the system, and you give back immediately a donor from D if you use a deceased donor. And so if you do so, you increase the percentage of patients that are grafted in the system in unpaired, and your median waiting time of unpaired patients decreases to 7 days here. And the waiting time of alone unpaired donors in the system also decreases because they will give immediately to, as soon as you use a deceased donors, you need to give back a donor from your waiting list D. And so their waiting time, median waiting time, decreases to 38 days. So I'm going to stop here before showing you the large market and what we are currently doing in the revision of the paper to answer any question. Okay, great. So let me show you what we are currently doing. First, you can tell me, wait, you have 78 pairs and you are using the full supply of deceased donors, which is big, okay? We have more than 14,000 kidneys in this data to decrease the waiting time of patients in P. And so maybe there is this problem of scale, right? If you increase the size of the market and participation increase, maybe the waiting time in P will actually increase because you can rely less on deceased donors because you have more competition between pairs. And what we are trying to add now is that actually this is not the case, because when you increase participation, you increase living donations, and actually you will use less the deceased donors to decrease the waiting time in P. So the more living pairs you have coming in your system, the more you can use them to decrease the waiting time in P. And we are currently doing more simulations to confirm it. So I can show you the very new results that we have to show you this. This is when you increase the size of the market by adding a percentage of these desensitized pairs in the system. You see that when you have 78 pairs, we matched 82% of the pairs. Now, when you increase the size, you increase the match rate, but also you decrease the percentage of grafts that are coming from deceased donors, because you will actually substitute deceased donors from living donors now, because you have more pairs participating in your system. And basically, we can see that the waiting time of these patients alone, unpaired patients in the system, decreases with also the size of the market. And so I hope this is convincing that the scale is not an issue here, because actually the more participation, the better it is for us. We need to rely less on the deceased donor to decrease the waiting time. And so what we are currently trying to do here is to link the theory with this integration to try to add the deceased donor list in the theoretical model. Okay, and preliminary results that we have a simple variation of the model that still gives a bound with the optimal mechanism when you have deceased donors. Okay, so it's slightly modified definition. I'm not going to enter the details here. And we are trying to have a variation of the model where we can, formalize this intuition that actually the more participation of pairs, the less you will use the deceased donor list in the system. So I will pause here. It's already a lot of information. Maybe stop here and see if there are any questions. Okay. So I'm going to finish earlier, but that's fine. We can discuss them. So the second type of simulations I wanted to show you are the large markets. So I showed you a little bit the ones already with the graph. And so we can try two types of simulation. The first one is to include these desensitized pairs, these 508 pairs that we have in our data, to make them switch from desensitization to kidney exchange program, and to see what happens with unpaired and also unpaired with DDL, because we have the exact compatibility for these pairs with the DDL. And the second thing we are doing is to simulate data that reproduce the US pools of APKD and NKR. Okay, so these are pure data-generated simulations, calibrated using data from Ashlagi et Ross 2020. And we can simulate bigger pools because the size of NKR is roughly 2,000 pairs participating in the system. So when you do this, so this is the result for France with desensitized pairs, the graph that I showed you earlier. So when you add all of them in the system, you have 586 pairs. Now, as I showed you on the graph, even without using the DDL, you already decrease the waiting time of patients in P. So you are alone in the system. And even when you use DDL, you further decrease also the waiting time of patients in P, even when you use the DDL. And I showed you in the graph before, but I haven't the figure here. But you also decrease the percentage of grafts that are coming from a deceased donor, which means that the more pairs in the system, the better it is, the more living donations you can perform in the system. And the second type of simulations are the US simulations. So this is the size of the NKR roughly in 2013. That's where we calibrate the data. Here, we don't have deceased donors. These are purely generated data. So even the compatibility is randomly drawn. And if you use Unpaired without DDL now, you can see that the performance is quite good. So of course, the gap between pairwise and Unpaired decreases because pairwise is better when you have also when the pool increases also, but the gap is still large. And you can see that the waiting time of unpaired patients that are waiting in P, even without DDL, is quite reasonable. We wait like 3 months here in this simulation. And basically, I'm done like 10 minutes earlier, but we can discuss more. And Philipp can also discuss the paper. So to wrap up, so we show with a simple theoretical model that this unpaired technology improves upon chain, which we already know improved upon pairwise exchanges. This is somehow close to an optimal mechanism, or at least we gave a bound of performance of unpaired in front of any mechanism. And empirically, we show that some of the theoretical results are confirmed. So, even if in the theory model, we don't have blood type, for instance, the data seems to confirm that this kind of comparisons hold also with true data. And the two risks I mentioned are also mitigated when you integrate unpaired with deceased donors and when you have more participation in the system. Okay? And the two can go end and end together. So maybe if you have a low participation, you can start to integrate the system with deceased donors. And the more participation you will have, the less you will rely on deceased donors to decrease the waiting time of patients in P. And the final version that I showed you matched up to 80% of the patients in the data. And as I was telling you, we are on the ongoing things that we are doing. We have a simple variations of the model to try to include the deceased donor list in the theoretical section. And I already showed you the graph that we try to have more empirical results to support the fact that the use of the DDL can scale with more participation in the system. And we are pinning down the final proposal, practical proposal for unpaired, depending on whether you ask a donor to give quickly to the deceased donor list or not, for instance, and to try to simulate these variations. So as you can see, there are a lot of possible variations, or you filter the deceased donors. What are the priorities you give in this list of patients and donors? So this is the very first trial to quantify some of the improvement, but the practical design needs to answer a lot of questions for the implementation. And basically that's it. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot, Julien. I think, Philipp, you can share your slides if you want.
Yeah, let me stop sharing mine.
Okay, so I don't have anything super deep. I will just follow the tradition we have and re-summarize the paper. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Let me do this.
Perfect.
So thanks a lot for having me as a discussant. This is a super nice paper, and really it was a pleasure to read it. So let me just summarize the idea in a picture. So suppose we have 3 pairs of patients, P1 and D1. So this is a patient-donor pair, P2 and D2, and P3 and D3. And I just draw a line when they are compatible. So here you could exchange kidneys, but if, so this is not good. So if patient 1 and donor 1 arrive at time 1, and patient 2 and donor 2 arrive also at time 1, then there's no exchange you can facilitate at time 1. If patient 3 and donor 3 only arrive at time 2. However, if you unpair that the pairs don't have to exchange together, then you could have patient 1 give to donor 2 at time 1, and you could have then at time 2 have patient 2 give to donor, donor 3 give to patient 2, and donor 1 give to patient 3, and thus have an exchange here by uncoupling these over time and across pairs. And so the main idea of the paper is to do this. And there are two issues which the paper has to deal with. So one is that this D1 donor, his patient received an organ without him donating. And so there's some risk that the donor might be reneging on his promise to donate later, especially because these promises cannot be made legally binding. And then there's this problem for the patient donor pair 2, where the donor gives before the patient receives an organ. So what this picture summarizes is, I think, that there are welfare gains to be had, but there are also some potential issues. And this paper tackles both. It does two things. It first quantifies how much welfare can be gained from kind of uncoupling the timing of these exchanges, or unpairing the timing of these exchanges. And it does so theoretically by using a model where they analyze the limit where some patients become very hard to match. But also it does so empirically and uses simulations using real data from French kidney exchange programs. And the main finding in the simulations is that there's actually a huge reduction in waiting times from this. So the benefits of this are huge. Then it also looks at the two issues I mentioned, and the simulations in the paper speak to that, and they essentially tell you that these are real issues because patients might have to wait for a long time. So I here took the simulations using the larger data set, but they have to wait for a long time potentially after donating before getting a kidney, and vice versa. They might receive a kidney long before donating. And so then the paper kind of find an kind of ingenious idea how to solve these issues, which I think might really be a problem for practical implementation. And the idea is to integrate with the deceased donor list. And so what that means is that when a kidney from the deceased donor list is compatible with the patient, it's matched. And then later on, or maybe earlier, the waiting donor gives a kidney to the list. So the paper is not cheating in the sense that it's increasing the number of kidneys by taking from the deceased donor list, but really the system has to give back to the list exactly the same number of kidneys. And what the simulations in the paper show is that this really solves the two issues before, because the number of days people have to wait drastically reduces. And so in that sense, it's a very round paper. It really analyzes the benefits and the cost of this, and shows that some costs are potentially large, but then it also proposes a way of resolving these issues. So let me maybe skip the model. I think the performance result about the optimum was a little bit unpaired, because the optimum here is really a very powerful algorithm which can see into the future. So this is really a very, very tough benchmark. And it's quite remarkable, I think, that the unpaired exchange achieves half of it. So let me just wrap up. So this is a technically quite challenging problem to analyze these. And so I guess I have three comments or questions maybe. So one comment is an interesting way of quantifying these benefits, maybe inspired a little bit by Mohammad's papers, is how much larger would you need to make the market to receive the same benefit you get from unpairing these matchings? That would be something I would find maybe an interesting way of quantifying this. And my second question is, in some sense, if the market becomes very large, then we can match everyone very quickly. And so almost by definition, the benefits of unpairing vanish. The benefits of most optimization vanish. The simulations show that even at the size of the US market, which is quite large, unpairing is still quite beneficial. I would just be interested in how large you need to make the markets for these benefits to become small. And then maybe a third question, which I don't have on the slides, is for the chain algorithm. It is actually, so what I've heard is that it's very important to pick these chains very carefully. And from what I'm understanding is here it's randomized who becomes the next kind of recipient in the chain. And I was just curious if it makes a difference if one kind of gives some omniscient power to the chain algorithm. in terms of differences in performances. But I mean, after all, this is a beautiful paper, and it really kind of deals with the cost and benefit of this change extremely nicely. Thank you.
Thanks, Philipp. So I guess I should answer. Or, yeah. So thanks a lot for your comments. Let me answer a few of your questions. So let's start with the chains. So for the chains in the theoretical model, if you have only one type, like let's say only hard to match, we know what is the order of magnitude of the optimal chain in some other papers. So this we can also show in the one-type model that Unpaired still improves upon this optimal chain. But you're right that there is a gap between the greedy and the optimal in theory and also in practice. So we don't have it in the paper, but we simulated it in our simulations. And you see a gap, but still the improvement of Unpaired is really significant. So that's something that we have. So the greedy match at least in the model is really coming from these two types that is very hard to analyze. But there are some, still in a one-type model, we can still say that Unpaired is better than the optimal chain. So that's one thing. The second question is how large the market should be. I think it's a very nice point. We tend to see a kind of very concave function for like pairwise so pairwise. I think it will take a very long time to reach the optimal. So at least in our, I guess since we have the exact constants in the theoretical model, maybe there are some easy equations to solve, maybe to see how much we should have the market bigger, even with simple simulations. So in the data, it's true that it's surprising that still we observe that Unpaired Unpaired improves upon chain and pairwise. So that was one thing. So it's similar to your paper with Itai recently, which is that when in our simulations we can see that the n in our theoretical model, when n tends to infinity, there is artificially no difference between the models. But as you say, they will reach the optimality at different levels of size of the market. So that's going to be that could be something very interesting to just point out. So the practical implementation of chains. You are right. It's very important to be careful that. So sometimes I know that Itai was telling us that in the US they are very careful to not finish with the AB donor, which is very likely to happen in chains. They try to not implement the optimal chain, finish a little bit earlier to keep going on quickly in the future. So I think these are things that we can try to simulate also in our data. But my guess is that still Unpaired would be significantly better than this. And I think there was a first question maybe that I forgot. Or
no, I didn't have another question. My comment was that given how huge the benefits are of carrying the market, maybe one quantification you could give is how much larger you have to make the market to kind of in a pairwise exchange have similarly large benefits.
Yeah. So I think in theory, in the theoretical model, we can have some type of quantification and simulations also. So that's something we are doing now, is also trying to simulate more complicated algorithm in the theoretical model that is analytically intractable, but that can still show some simulations out of it. And also in the empirical part, because we simulate the US data, maybe we can push a little bit the size of the market also to see by how much we need to increase. So my guess is that it's very concave. So it will take a very long time for pairwise to reach a given level of Unpaired, but that would be interesting to do, yes. Thanks. So I don't know if there are any questions. So
I think there is a question from Marco.
Yeah, hi. So this is very interesting. And I was wondering about the integration of, I guess, cross-country markets, because those disease donor lists, I guess, are separate. And depending on the policies in the different countries, you could imagine those lists to be of a different size. So like, is there a way to, well, a simple way to balance those incentives and potentially, well, I guess even, well, probably like there should, like if there's a simple system where you benefit from a bigger market size that I guess helps everyone involved. So I'm wondering whether this should be, I don't know, self-enforcing in the sense that like once like 2 countries merge their markets, like others will join. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, it's an important topic in kidney exchange today for the question of merging different markets, especially when they have different structure. So far we are not investigating this in the paper. It's a bit maybe related to a bit Philipp's point of the size of the participation. And as I said, maybe in the presentation, when you increase the participation, actually you decrease the use of deceased donors in the system. So actually it might be beneficial for Unpaired to increase the size and the participation and maybe merge markets together, at least to decrease the use of the DDL. That's what I would expect. Then the exact incentive to participate, it's still, I would say, open and discuss questions even for standard mechanisms today. And I think it's a promising. So what will be interesting is it's true that each mechanism gives different incentives to join a pool. So whether Unpaired will give more incentive for or less maybe, because now that you unpair the patients and the donor, just the size matters. So maybe then you just have a question of increasing the size and that's it. But the type of incentive that Unpaired can give can be interesting to investigate, yes, in this framework. I don't know if I answer completely. For the legal framework of deceased donors, my guess is that if you have enough living donors, then you should not worry too much about the integration of the deceased donors in the system. But yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
We have also a question in the chat from Roland, but I don't know if he can speak given his connection or if I should ask a question. Roland, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, okay. Hello. Yeah, I was wondering what you see as a practical or the biggest practical hurdle for implementing this unpaired regime. And I was wondering whether it is the fact that you, in order to make it work, kind of couple it with the DDL list, and some countries may not want to do that and change the prioritization of this list. I was wondering, do you think that may be the biggest concern, or are there also other concerns that countries may have that would prevent them from going for such a solution?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point in terms of practical implementation. So that's a very last question because it will allow me to announce what is happening in France in terms of kidney exchange. So we have been working with Olivier and Victor and Yinghua to advise the agency. And so they are going to switch to a system where they will use chains from deceased donors because we don't want to have altruistic donor. So it's still going to be voted by law. So I don't want to be too... So probably before summer it's going to pass, but what we designed for them was a system where you actually ask a donor to start a chain, a living donor to start a chain from Unpaired. So you unpair the donor from the patient, and then you give a priority on the deceased donor list to the patient to receive later on. So you see the similarity here, which is you unpair the donor to do a chain, and you give a certain priority to the patient to receive later on. And we did some, policy simulations for them where they accepted to do that. So they define very clearly where they wanted the priority to be. And so basically what they did is to put them at the top of the national lists, but below the super priorities, they call it. So like if you have emergency, someone who is going to die and needs to receive immediately a kidney, they don't want to overcome this priority. They didn't want to overcome the hypersensitized patients priority either, so they will be just below this hypersensitized patients. But basically they accept it, so there is a kind of this spirit of giving an extra priority to accommodate the kidney exchange program with the deceased donor list. And they will unpair the donor to start chains, and then the patient will receive later on. it's going to be a bit different from unpaired because this unpaired patient is not going to be able to receive later on from a living donor. You know, like these patients that are unpaired in P, they might receive from the deceased donor list, but they might also receive propositions from the system of the kidney exchange program from living donors. And this is not something that they are going to do. What they are going to do is just start a chain and then you receive from the deceased donor list. So that's something that at least in France they're accepted to do. I know that Italy is also doing chains from deceased donors, but a bit differently because they don't break the unpaired patient and donor, I think. And so that's one thing. So whether it's a big concern for countries or not, I would say that we have to be very careful about this new risk that is the waiting time of unpaired patients. So that's something that this technology introduces, and we have to be very careful to check that these patients are not, hurt or even die in the system. So that's why we are very careful at studying this. And in terms of biggest constraint, I'm not sure whether so my guess also it's because maybe you can convince to start to use a bit the deceased donor list, but as soon as more people join and participate, also you need to rely less on it. So maybe that's also an argument for the policymaker to use that as a transition from a low market participation going to unpaired and mitigating the effects with the deceased donor list and then relying less and less on this. So that's things that happen in the design of deceased donors waiting list. So changing the priority of some group of patients that happen over the time. If now you have a group of patients that are kidney exchange program patients, maybe at the beginning you give them high points, and then if you realize later on that it's a bit unfair and that actually they are doing well, you can rechange the priority that you give to them. So that could be also an option. So I'm not sure I answer completely your question, but that to give you a bit of flavor of the discussion we had, and at least I know one country that is accepting to do this kind of change of priority of deceased donors to integrate with the kidney exchange program.
Okay, just before the next questions coming, first, thank you very much, Julien, for the talk. It was great. I think we all learned a lot. Thanks a lot, Philipp, too, for the discussion. It was also fantastic. So let me announce the next talk, which will be in 2 weeks. We will have Theo Offerman from the University of Amsterdam. He will talk about MOAs in multi-unit markets. So now we have plenty of time to keep going to discuss and to see how to exchange kidney between each other.